Good afternoon, Internet and all the ships at sea. I'm Ross Douthat, and welcome to an afternoon discussion of 2020 and the future of the right, which is sponsored by the good auspices of the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America, which is, by its own description, the nation's leading academic institute committed to increasing understanding of the economic, cultural, and social conditions vital for human flourishing. And by my description, is just a terrific place that hosts all kinds of fascinating conversations, including this one, I'm sure, and many more, which you can find on its website and many other places online. And you can trust me in that because I am, in fact, in addition to being an op-ed columnist for the New York Times, a media fellow with IHE, so I obviously know whereof I speak. So for our conversation today, which is about, I think, what happens to conservatism after the 2020 election, which means inevitably we'll talk a bit about the election itself, but also try and talk sort of long-term about trends on the right, the meaning of Donald Trump, and other exciting topics. And I'm joined by, I would say, three of the leading experts on American conservatism, who will hopefully carry the conversation and allow me to just observe in silence and maybe very occasionally intervene. So moving from right to left on my screen, first, Dan Mccarthy, Daniel McCarthy, if we're feeling formal, is the editor of Modern Age, a distinguished American conservative quarterly, and he's also the director of the Novak Journalism Fellowship at the Fund for American Studies. Previously, he was editor of the American Conservative, and his work has appeared in many places, including my own newspaper's op-ed page. Then moving over one screen, Ramesh Ponnuru is a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He's a senior editor for National Review, and he's a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and a contributor to CBS News. He's a prolific writer, a genius at public policy, and the author of The Party of Death, The Democrats, the Media, the Courts, and the Disregard for Human Life, which came out amazingly 14 years ago in 2006. And then finally, representing the other political wing of Modern Age is Samuel Goldman, who in his day job is an associate professor of political science at the George Washington University and the executive director of the John Loeb Jr. Institute for Religious Freedom. His book, God's Country, Christian Zionism in America, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2018. And his next book, After Nationalism, which I suspect has some interesting implications for our conversation today, is coming out in 2021. And my little joke about Modern Age reflects the fact that in addition to his academic work, Sam is literary editor at Modern Age itself. So that is the incredibly distinguished biographies of our incredibly distinguished panelists. Hopefully it whets your appetite for everything that they have to say. And we're going to try and have a mostly free-flowing conversation for the next 45 minutes or so, and then pivot to your questions and go through till about 3:15 and try and wrap up around then. And so I'll just do a tiny bit of framing. I think it's no secret to anyone who has followed the ins and outs of the last, I guess we can say, 5 years now since Donald Trump descended the escalator and entered American politics fully, that there is a lot of interest and argument about what the Trump era means for the American right. Clearly, Trump is some kind of transitional/transformational figure. He did not run as either a movement conservative or as a sort of any kind of old-fashioned Republican in 2016. He won despite the opposition of most of his party's establishment, and he blazed a trail, or maybe followed a trail, that has also been traced by lots of different populist politicians and nationalist politicians the world over. So the questions raised by his presidency include, is the Republican Party becoming decisively a kind of working class populist party? Is fusionism, the old alliance between libertarians and social conservatives, dead or dying under Trump? Is Trump someone who is sort of just an opportunist who, once in power, has sort of returned to old Reaganite orthodoxies within the party? Is he an authoritarian threat to democracy, or the embodiment of a democratic rebellion against elites? I could go on for another 5 minutes listing questions, but I think that gives a sense of some of the places that arguments over the future of the right have been carried on of late. And so I'm just going to start by going from there and posing an initial question to each of our panelists. And I'll start with you, Dan. Let's assume, for the sake of argument and based on the current situation in the polls, that Donald Trump loses in 2 weeks' time and Joe Biden becomes president of the United States. What do you think the political and intellectual, you can separate those or combine them, legacy of the Trump era will be in 2022 or 2024 or 2030? You can go out as far as you like.
Well, I think the initial effect is simply going to be to strengthen some of the tendencies we've seen on the right going back 20 years and more. So there's been a populist stream on the right going back to the days of Ross Perot and Pat Buchanan. That now I think is going to be somewhat strengthened. But at the same time, a lot of what Donald Trump has done as president has actually been in keeping with the old fusionism. The fact that in 2018, as the Republicans went into the midterms, the primary legislative achievement they had at that point was the tax cut. The fact that going into the November election this year, the Amy Coney Barrett hearings are kind of a sign of just how dedicated Donald Trump has been to social conservatives and to judicial originalists. So it seems to me that Donald Trump is, for all that he is shocking and a bit of a change from the style of politics past, both in terms of some of the things that seem to be new about Donald Trump in terms of foreign policy, immigration, trade policy, but also in terms of many of the consistencies that Donald Trump has with the conservatism that has gone before. It's pretty easy to see how these things might move forward in the next 2 years or 4 years or 5 or 10 years. And I think you're going to see a number of Republicans, in fact, you already have, who are going to try to reincorporate what's apparently novel or relatively what has been underplayed on the conservative movement up until Donald Trump arrived. They're going to incorporate that into the sort of omnibus package of conservative perspectives. So I think someone like Ted Cruz, for example, has already shown great adaptability in his ability, as we saw in 2016, to incorporate some of the Ron Paul and Rand Paul themes in his campaign that year. I expect that, Ted Cruz is probably someone who's going to run for president again. And when he does so, he'll sound a little bit more like Donald Trump, but he won't sound entirely like Donald Trump. Similarly, Marco Rubio, who many people would see as being quite sort of antipodal in some respects to Donald Trump. Nevertheless, if you look at the work that his Senate office has been doing, a lot of it has actually focused on questions related to economic nationalism, related to trade, related to working class economics. This, I think, will be a theme that Marco Rubio continues to embrace and to explore. And even someone like Nikki Haley, who might be considered sort of the presumptive neoconservative favorite for 2024 or for some point in the future, she too, given her background with the Trump administration, I think is going to try to make an appeal to Donald Trump voters and is going to try to triangulate between a more internationalist, perhaps, view of foreign policy and some view of domestic policy that is going to be in keeping with the Trump themes. So I think that an integration of Trumpism with the existing conservative movement is the most predictable development. I do believe that if Donald Trump loses, you're of course going to see a lot of conservatism will be defined in reaction to the new Democratic administration, in reaction to Biden and Harris. And we will find out exactly what form that will take. I think with Barack Obama, we didn't quite have, we didn't know for certain that we were going to get the Tea Party. The sort of demotic populist elements on the right that did give you the Tea Party and that are right now very upset about the lockdowns and the COVID restrictions, those will continue into a Biden and Harris administration and will probably take some more institutionalized form. And that element of the right, which people might think of as being Trumpist, but in fact has been pre-existing for many years, is going to, I think, continue to be very powerful. It'll be a gravitational force on the right, and it's going to have considerable influence on Republican Party politics. And in some ways, on the political level, things like QAnon probably are more of the wave of the future than some of the intellectual tendencies we might want to emphasize. But that's been the case, again, not just during the Trump years, but I think it's been the case going back quite some time. And the right has actually been very fluid about taking on new media developments, whether it was newsletters back in the 1980s and 1990s, talk radio, then the internet, and now the various different forms of internet communications. The right seems to be even speedier than the left in terms of adopting new media and adapting them for its sort of populist programs. And I expect that will continue.
That's a very provocative place on which to end, but I'll resist the bait and turn to Ramesh and ask you the same question. Trumpism's legacy 4 to 8 to 15 years hence, what do you think?
Well, I think that it is going to depend a lot on the outcome and not just the top line of the outcome as to obviously whether Trump wins or loses, but do Republicans hold the Senate? If there's a narrow defeat for Trump and Republicans hold the Senate, I think that looks very different than if it's a landslide and Republicans lose the Kansas Senate seat, for example. It doesn't really, it doesn't change the arguments that any of the factions in the party will make after the election so much as it'll change the way sort of up for grabs people in the middle who aren't particularly tied to any of those factions will receive those arguments. President Trump sort of destroyed an old Republican Party / conservative consensus formula or program, but didn't really replace it with anything, partly because sort of not the kind of political figure that he is, partly because there wasn't really a group of Republican underlings he could hire who were committed to fleshing out a kind of Trumpist program. And of course, he was dealing with, particularly for the first 2 years, a Congress that started out with very different assumptions and priorities. So what we ended up with was a kind of synthesis of a kind, or maybe a mishmash is a better way of putting it, of some traditional conservative policies, some distinctively Trumpian elements, and even a little bit of what we used to call reform conservative ideas, but nothing really particularly coherent, fleshed out, or seemingly all that important to the president and his strongest political supporters. And I think that we remain in a sort of flux as Republicans and conservatives right now. So I think that after the election, things are going to be pretty wide open. There will be some sentiment in the party for trying to revert to the status quo ante Trump. I don't know that it's going to be all that strong a tendency, and I don't know, I don't think that it would be successful. But there's also going to be other tendencies. The bottom line, though, it struck me for quite some time, even before Trump, that the basic conservative coalition is going to be, to be hopefully not too schematic about it, but it's going to be working class cultural conservatives, generally white, business-oriented moderates, and kind of Tea Party, fusionist, full spectrum conservatives that we're all familiar with. These factions don't always agree with one another. No faction is going to have the upper hand within the coalition at all times. And if you add up the elements of the coalition, they're not a majority of the country. So they have to expand, and they have to appeal to people who aren't particularly part of any of them. I think one difference with the sort of post-Trump Republican Party compared to the pre-Trump Republican Party is that the working class nationalist element is stronger than it used to be. It's larger. I mean, that was a pre-existing trend for Trump that he accelerated. And it's a little bit more self-conscious of itself as having a kind of distinct point of view and identity. And so the difficulties of coalition management are, I think, not going to become easier for conservatives, even if for a time they're papered over by the shared imperative of beating back whatever Biden and Harris are trying to do.
Sam, I'm going to turn to you next, and I just wanted to mention you wrote a terrific op-ed for the Times op-ed page, arguing in effect that fusionism, sort of the old ideological and intellectual status quo on the right, probably had more legs or more of a future than a lot of people observing the Trump era might think. So I'm wondering if, in answering my initial question, you can talk a little bit about how you see that part of things.
Sure. And I think that my observations are probably consistent with some of the things that Dan and Ramesh have already said. So first of all, like Dan, I think there's probably more continuity here than either some of Trump's most enthusiastic supporters or some of his most devoted critics have expected. Tensions between libertarians and social conservatives, between a demotic or populist element and an intellectual elite, are really nothing new in conservative or Republican politics. And even before the Buchanan-Perot moment to which Dan alluded, they were an important factor in the rise of Ronald Reagan and the so-called new right of the late 1970s and early 1980s, which made very effective use of the new media of its own time. So even as a question of practical politics, the present situation is not as new as one might think. Second, and consistent with Ramesh's suggestions, any political movement is a coalition, and I don't think that it will be possible for post-Trump conservatives or post-Trump Republicans to simply write off any of the pre-existing tendencies or factions. There has been a great deal of rhetoric about finally kicking out the libertarians from social conservatives to some extent, and also economic nationalists. I don't think that's going to happen. The basic elements of the conservative coalition remain more or less what they were, but the balance of power may shift among them. And that raises the question of what ultimately they have in common. And part of what they have in common, and again, this is true of any political coalition, is a kind of negative association, is opposition to the Democratic Party and to the American left, broadly speaking. And as long as the Democratic Party and the left survive, there will be opposition to them. And that will provide a sort of centripetal force among these contending factions, even though they don't and will not agree about everything. But also, I think, or at least I tried to argue in my piece for The Times, that what once was called fusionism, or at least fusionism as I understand it, which is not the same way that everybody does, remains a viable point of contact among these factions. And that is a recognition that on the one hand, there are traditional virtues, habits, ways of life and institutions that we wish to preserve, and that the use of coercive force, the use of politics is necessary to do that. But also an appreciation for the centrality of personal freedom. Not necessarily in a theoretical libertarian sense, but certainly in an American Jeffersonian sense, an appeal to living your life more or less the way you want to, consistent with obedience to the law and respect for the rights and vital interests of others. And it strikes me that particularly in this campaign in 2020, Trump has often been successful when he's appealed to those themes. So to take only one example, which is the recent debate about free speech and moderation, or arguably censorship by social media companies, the banner of criticism of Twitter and Facebook is free speech, is the right to express yourself and to exchange information. So I don't think that the old effort to somehow balance considerations of continuity and tradition with freedom is dead, and that I think that any Republican politician who hopes to be successful, at least nationally, after Trump, is going to have to make at least some efforts in that direction.
So I want to pause on the question of faction for a minute, because I think I sort of have a general question for all of you about what we think the factions are in a post-Trump Republican Party. Dan cited a bunch of politicians who could be plausible figureheads for different factions. Sam talked, a bit about the marriage of sort of the libertarian and social conservative tradition, but you could imagine those sort of having separate vectors. But first, what about the faction that gets called Never Trump, which is, I think, in some ways sees itself, and I'm thinking here of sort of, a variety of figures ranging from retired Republican politicians to figures like Bill Kristol, the former editor of the Weekly Standard, to various newspaper columnists, to the people running the Lincoln Project, and so on. There's sort of a whole constellation of media figures who are in some sense connected to actual voters, in the sense that there are a bunch of Republican voters who aren't voting for Trump and are voting for Joe Biden. And that faction, I think, at times at least, sees itself as sort of the defender of this kind of marriage of personal responsibility and some kind of classical liberalism that Sam is gesturing at. What becomes of Never Trump?
Is that for me in particular?
It's for anybody, but you can go.
Well, I'll just answer briefly and provocatively and say that the full Never Trump TM movement has probably written itself out of Republican and conservative politics, and it's worth remembering, since people who describe themselves this way often compare themselves to the rebels against Nixon in the 1970s, that they were wiped out, including Governor Hogan's father, who famously lost his seat in the House of Representatives and never returned to high office. And on the contrary, it was those who stuck with Nixon to the end, including Reagan, but also, as many people forget, George H.W. Bush, who were able to survive in the party and to remake it in their own ways. So I think the sort of Lincoln Project version of Never Trump probably has left the coalition behind once and for all. I don't think that's necessarily true of politicians and even more voters who may have had hesitations about Trump the man, but are willing to work with the tendencies that he has represented and brought to the fore. And I think that's where the sort of negative incentive of opposing the left becomes important. So on the assumption of your question that Trump loses, there is a Biden-Harris presidency, and let's suppose that it proceeds to do some of the things that people are talking about, from packing the Supreme Court to passing an aggressive gender equity act. That's going to bring back some of the people, I suspect, who are not comfortable with Trump the man, but nevertheless believe that they're going to get more out of cooperation with these other factions or tendencies than they will outside the tent.
Dan and Ramesh, if either of you want to weigh in on Never Trump, by all means. My general question to both of you is, let's suppose we come to 2024 and there's a four-way primary season battle, or a three-way primary season battle on the Republican side. If you go back to 2016, there was sort of an assumption that the party would sort of have a face-off between figures who embodied a kind of reform-minded establishment led by Jeb Bush, and figures who sort of spoke for Tea Party zeal and the Tea Party base, meaning, in different ways, Ted Cruz or Rand Paul. What do we imagine as the sort of equivalent contest 4 years from now? What do you guys think?
So, I'll speak to Sam's points because I sort of wish that Sam is correct, but I think that he may be incorrect, and that in fact, a lot of the Never Trumpers, maybe not, the most hardline Lincoln Project types, but I think more of them than one might expect will reintegrate into the conservative movement and into the Republican Party without any difficulty. And, so much of their attacks on Trump have been personalized as opposed to talking about issues, that I think once Trump is out of the picture, they're going to have a fairly easy time claiming to be, regular conservatives, claiming to have, interests about, social policy and about taxes and all the bread and butter issues that will make them seem once again like normal conservatives. And they'll also leverage a lot of influence within the media and a lot of fundraising acumen. And those things count within a movement.
Who do you have in mind, Dan? Like who are the Never Trump thought leaders? Apart from some New York Times columnists who will reintegrate post Trump.
Well, I don't know about Bill Kristol himself, but I think a lot of the people around him could do so. And certainly I think the Dispatch with David French and Jonah Goldberg, who are de facto Never Trumpers, if not announced Never Trumpers, but they already have been very careful to keep a foot in both camps, so to speak. And I suspect they will try to be, once again, present themselves as spokespersons for conservatism as a whole after the Trump era, rather than simply being people who are in a rather awkward middle ground between the pure Never Trumpers and the people who are supporting President Trump. And then just more broadly, I think there's a whole constellation of people out there. Really, there's this middle ground between people who are very reluctant Trump supporters and people who are, sort of deliberately evasive, and then people who are, never Trump, but not never conservative. And then you have some people who've gone all the way to being basically never conservative, who say, well, the Republican Party needs to be burned to the ground and the conservative movement needs to be sort of uprooted. So obviously those people on the farthest side perhaps may not be returning to the conservative fold, but I think almost all the others will. And, in some ways I wish the conservative movement would be a little more disciplined perhaps in not accepting them back. But, that's simply not the way politics works. It's people forget very quickly, and politics, changes its complexion almost entirely within a very short period of time. And I agree with Sam when he says that, a lot of what happens in the future is going to be about the conservative reaction to Harris and Biden, much more so than about rehashing the Trump era. Now, that said, it is true that, the opponents of Nixon were completely wiped out, but it seems to me that a lot of the intellectuals and to a lesser extent perhaps, but also to some extent the, sort of campaign professionals attached to the Never Trump movement are people who are actually very, very skilled at positioning themselves. And they're not just, a moderate faction within the Republican Party. They're people who actually are quite skilled at picking up political themes and applying them however is going to be, sort of most effective in elite media, certainly. But they even have some degree of ability to sway, maybe not the real public out there, the broad public, but certainly enough, gatekeepers on the right, they'll be able to find their way back in.
So if I could add my own tentative thoughts on this.
Yes.
It seems to me, my initial thought is that it's highly unlikely that whoever the Republican Party nominates in 2024 will be somebody who explicitly repudiates Trump and Trumpism, unless there is a clear Trumpite candidate in the race, such as somebody with the last name Trump, in which case the dynamics of that could be changed, and somebody might be able to run a successful campaign saying, let's not do this again. But otherwise, I think it will be the kind of the post-Watergate scenario, again, assuming a defeat, which is, people move on and people sort of don't speak of the recent past all that much. When it comes to sort of the intellectuals and writers and sort of prominent figures associated with Never Trump, it's a small group of people, and it is a divided group of people, as Dan's rundown suggests. It's a factionalized group. There are some people who think that they're in the French Resistance, plus they get ad commissions. And then there are some people who just can't abide Trump personally, but would still like to see the Republicans retain the Senate. And they're going to have different fates depending on the choices they make and sort of how far out they've gotten from the center of gravity of the conservative coalition. But I think the more interesting question is what happens to the voters who have been voting Republican generally, or at least have been open to Republicans, but have been really turned off by Trump, voted for Democrats in the midterms in 2018, are preparing to vote or have voted for Biden-Harris. Are any of those voters going to come back. And my guess is that you're basically going to see the same trends we've been seeing for quite a while, which is college-educated white voters are going to be a smaller and smaller portion of the Republican Party. So a lot of those Romney-Clinton voters, I think, so a lot of them voted for Republican candidates in 2016, didn't in 2018, and I suspect a lot of them are not going to come back.
So then to just come back to my 2024 question, right, and I'll try and fuse it, if you will, with the questions about fusionism. It seems like sort of whoever the candidates are, one of the questions sort of on the ballot the next time Republicans choose a leader will be, to what extent does the trend Ramesh is describing need to be halted, or to what extent does the party need to lean into it, right? And to some extent, you could say that, fusionism in its older form was an ideology well suited to a certain kind of sort of, reasonably well-off, somewhat religious American suburbanite, right? The sort of marriage of a sort of mild politics of virtue with a mild politics of limited government has a particular appeal, I think, in that zone. And so I guess two questions, or maybe an entangled question, right? Like, is that going to be the choice for the Republican Party? Do you go further into a sort of working class politics and say we just need to win more Black and Hispanic men?
Yeah, that's it.
Do you think that's where we go?
Well, I mean,
like Nikki Haley is a candidate, right? I imagine that the vision of whoever is running Nikki Haley's 2024 campaign will be, this is a candidate who wins the suburbs back, which will be different from the vision of some other candidates.
Well, look, I mean, parties that sort of are bouncing back do tend to do a little bit better with a lot of different demographic groups, even if their increases are more concentrated in some of them. And so I don't think it's nutty to think, that you should try to do a little bit better among the Clinton Romney voters in the future, while also holding on to a lot of Obama Trump voters. But I mean, I think your question got to the right place, which is that you can have this trade. You can lose a lot of upper middle class and pick up a lot of lower middle class whites, so long as you're also getting more non-white voters. Now, what I would like to see, I don't know if this is going to happen, but what I would like to see is for that to happen, but that for the way Republicans think about getting non-white voters to be less like the sort of pre-Trump kind of autopsy approach, where it's all about softening stands on issues like immigration, and B, talking to everybody about how they should all start their own companies, and frankly that there will be more of a social cultural conservative message to those non-white voters who are open to it. But otherwise, I do think it's pretty hard to see how you get past this demographic problem.
And yet, if I may just interject briefly, I've seen both some survey data as well as anecdotal reporting that suggests that paradoxically, the non-white voters to whom Trump has successfully appealed, or more successfully than Romney, are the ones who are closer to the old fusionist suburban model. So for whites, higher education is negatively correlated with support for Republicans. For Black and Hispanic voters, the opposite seems to be true. In other words, Trump seems to be doing better with Black and Hispanic voters who have gone to college. And anecdotally, I'm not aware of data, although they may exist, the sort of traditional small business appeal of Republicans seems to be very popular with many of those voters. So it's not clear to me, actually, that the way to attract more non-white voters is necessarily to do the same things that attract larger and larger numbers of whites without college degrees.
Well, so I think 538 has some data out today on this white versus non-white question, and looking at sort of precisely how Trump has sort of made some gains among minority voters, even as he's losing ground with white voters. And I think one of the notable things there, too, is just sort of the clarity with which right now American politics is polarizing by gender, right? That sort of, this, obviously it's already polarized by race in various ways. And the big story of the Trump era has often been polarization by class. But, if you're trying to predict whether a Black or Hispanic American is going to consider Donald Trump, you start with their gender, right? And you go from there. And I guess I'm curious if any of you have thoughts about whether this becomes sort of an issue for Republicans that the party starts fighting about, like how do you get female voters back over the next 4 to 6 years?
Well, I think it's tied in with the question we've just been discussing about the class and race components of the Republican pitch in the future. The question about appealing to women is in part a question about economic destiny as well, and what kind of life women see for themselves. And there is a side of the Republican Party and a side of the conservative movement which basically embraces what might be called liberal, in a very broad sense, views of the future of the economy, that it's going to be a future of service work, that the working class jobs we have right now, the sort of hard industry jobs, that those are the wave of the past, they're falling away. And the future of service-oriented work, the future of work that is going to be very much subject to much more ideological pressure, I think, than simply working on a factory line, where HR departments have higher sway over things. These are environments in which a certain kind of professional are able to thrive, and a certain kind of masculine identity, perhaps, is not able to thrive. And this fault line is, I think, going to run throughout our politics, not only on the right and among conservatives and Republicans, but I think we're going to see it increasingly on the left as well. And it's interesting to look at some of the demographic differences, certainly in terms of Hispanics, for example, with Bernie Sanders versus Joe Biden, and that there was a notable gap between Biden's Hispanic support and the fact that Bernie Sanders was doing quite well in that demographic. And I haven't looked at all of the sort of gender data on this as well, but it does seem to me that there are implications for these different models in that respect. So I think that one of the difficulties that the conservative coalition is going to face in the future is going to be what kind of economy it imagines, whether it's going to be basically a sexless economy, an economy of all service work where people are totally interchangeable, or whether it's going to be an economy in which there are certainly components of it which really do have a strong gender bias in one direction or another. And these are obviously, sort of live wires, and talking about them as a politician would be extremely dangerous, although it could also be, sort of a way of gaining an advantage over people who are less likely to take risks than you might be. In the same way that Donald Trump, by saying a lot of provocative things in 2016, was able to gain an advantage over the much more conventional opponents he was facing, both in the Republican primaries and in the general election. In the future, I mean, just as we've seen, all of these sort of new developments in the ways in which women and men interact with one another, whether it's the Me Too movement, whether it's, some of the craziness we've seen from people who are called incels, there really is something very profound happening among Americans right now on this level. It's something that, doesn't translate into politics in a sort of a direct way, but that I think does have the sort of capacity to reshape both ideologically and also economically, and then ultimately politically, how all of these different components of the right and of the left fit together.
I mean, I've been struck by the gap between approval ratings right now for Amy Coney Barrett and approval ratings for the president who nominated her, and also the gap between the numbers in favor for confirmation in polls and the numbers that favored Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation. And I'm curious if you guys think that there is contained in, I sort of, I was a big supporter of Barrett's nomination. I thought she should have been nominated instead of Kavanaugh way back, but I've been surprised. I thought she would be less popular and sort of more easily cast as an avatar for, extreme right-wing Catholicism. And I'm wondering if there are sort of implications there about how conservatism is perceived as filtered through, through gender differences, through different kinds of figures, but, female avatars versus male avatars, or is it just sort of particular to her, do you guys think?
Well, I mean, she is the complete, panoply of good qualities that you want, right? So I think she is in some ways an ideal which may be very difficult to replicate in other circumstances. So she is a mother of a large family. She is an extremely accomplished jurist in her own right and academic. And so you can bring together these different elements, and she's she represents for conservatives certainly a point of consensus and convergence on originalism, on the right to life, at least by implication. And all of that, I think, is makes for a maximal sort of coherence and approval among conservatives. She's not someone who's going out and is involved in the difficult questions of economic nationalism or immigration or some of these things that are the dividing lines on the right. Not yet. And as a justice, she will be, but right now that's not an issue. So, and then in terms of how well she's doing with the American public as a whole, again, I think she just presents a very good image. She is, quite youthful. She is, a wife and mother, but also a professional woman. She really represents, I think, both what traditionalists who have a certain view of gender and also what, what might be called liberals or neoliberals who have another view of gender, but they can converge on someone like Amy Coney Barrett. But because that's
she's the fusionist, the fusionist.
But I think it is there are an unusual confluence of circumstances that make her sort of successful in that respect, which are going to be hard to keep together in certainly someone who is running for president, for example, is going to have face more divisions than I think someone like Amy Coney Barrett's facing in her confirmation hearing.
Well, she's going to look very different. She's going to look very different to the public when she gets rid of Griswold versus Connecticut, which I gather is scheduled for February based on my reading of Twitter, and that'll be a very interesting thing to watch. No, I think that a couple things. One, I think one of the reasons that the conservative movement and the Republican Party bounced back so quickly from the real nadir of the late Bush years, George W. Bush years, when, as you remember, the outgoing president left in the high 20s in the approval rating, is because so much of the opposition was personalized to George W. Bush. And that made it kind of easy to not be him. And I think that part of what we're seeing is that it's the bar for being a reasonable, sensible, nice conservative is so low right now, thanks to Trump. It's been very advantageous to a lot of us. And then the other thing about Barrett that I think is kind of interesting is because it does seem as though, and we've kind of alluded to this in various ways, that conservatism has been getting less libertarian over the last generation or so, but judicial conservatism has been getting more libertarian. I'm not sure that Barrett's an exception to that, and that could, and yet at the same time, the judicial confirmations are one of the great triumphs of conservatism in this period, and you could see at some point these things leading to a clash.
Yeah, I mean, do you think, Ramesh, that unlike the Obama years, there will be a very clear sense in which the center of gravity of conservative power, assuming Barrett is confirmed, in the first 2 years of the Biden presidency will be the Supreme Court. Do you expect anything strange to come of that?
Nothing is strange anymore, Ross. So,
right. No, that's fair. Anything worth commenting on? How about that?
But yeah, no, I think that in a way, this is the exact kind of situation that Chief Justice Roberts is most concerned about, right? That you've got a conservative Supreme Court in which all conservative hopes have to rest, confronting a political configuration of power in the other branches that is extraordinarily hostile to it. And I think that is one of the things that led to the punt in the Obamacare case in 2012, and arguably the second punt in the 2015 Obamacare case. But then there's the question of whether he'll be able to maintain a kind of prudent, incrementalist, cautious strategy, given the composition of the court. Of course, he could have 4 or 5 new colleagues next year, so that would change the mix as well.
Well, and on that front, and we're going to go about another 5 minutes and then start taking your questions. But on that front, what do you guys think I mean, I think we can assume that the first order of business for a potential Biden presidency would be some kind of, omnibus COVID relief package that doubles as, sort of a stimulus bill filled with Democratic priorities. Assume that that is, at least relatively popular. What do we think the first sort of conservatism what do you think the first flashpoint is under President Biden that defines what kind of shape the conservative opposition starts to take? And this is pure guesswork and punditry here. You don't have to have, any kind of claim to certain knowledge.
Well, Ross, I think your assumption there might be incorrect, that in fact, if Biden comes out with a omnibus package that's largely directed at COVID, I think you will actually see an enormous amount of opposition from conservatives. Right now, in fact, you've seen kind of a division between the Trump administration, which goes back and forth about how much COVID relief it wants to provide, and Republicans in Congress who generally want to sort of restrain the amount of spending that's taking place. If you have a Biden-Harris administration, the Republicans will not have that division anymore whatsoever. They will be strongly opposed, I think, to large spending bills that are sold as being COVID-related. And at the grassroots, you have to take into account, I think, populist attitudes. I shouldn't even say populist attitudes, but just sort of attitudes that are suspicious of authority at the grassroots. So, you get a vaccine during a Biden-Harris administration. You have to think about how the, sort of demonic right is going to respond to that. When it comes to, sort of continuing lockdowns and continuing restrictions on people's liberties that are justified in the name of COVID, I think, again, you're going to see that libertarians and sort of right-wing populist Trump people will come together in fact, opposing those kinds of measures. So COVID may be the big question for the next, several months of a Biden-Harris administration. What it will actually do is help to glue the right together, and it'll glue the right together in a way that will be very reactive, but that may, in fact, be quite coherent and quite powerful.
So it seems to me that I agree with Dan, because in part, I think a COVID relief package will have enough elements of the Green New Deal and enough elements of the ambitious childcare proposals of liberals that you'll be able to attack it on a lot of different grounds. And politically, it will just be the Green New Deal for a lot of the grassroots right. But the other thing that strikes me is, if you want to abolish the filibuster and pack the courts and add some new Democratic leaning, or hopefully in their view, Democratic leaning states, then you don't want to lead with a huge contentious stimulus package that bogs you down and depletes your momentum. In fact, what you want to do is some kind of voting rights thing. Then you have the filibuster fight, and you can say that these people are using Jim Crow tactics. You break the filibuster, you pack the court, and so forth. I just don't think that kind of political reform agenda, as risky as it is for liberals and Democrats, it's not something you can do second, right? If you want to do it, I think you just have to, that's going to have to be what you spend your capital on. And part of the risk of that is, of course, if people are still hurting, and your main agenda item is something that is obviously about empowering yourself, that's a big problem.
But
I'm sure it's not where Biden wants to go, and I'm pretty sure he can't be made to go there, but maybe he can.
Yeah, see, I just think, to put on my pundit's hat for a second, that everything we've seen about the Biden campaign suggests a kind of, at times, almost preternatural sort of focus on supporting things that are popular and not things that are unpopular. And
look, one way this could go is the Affordable Care Act is obvious from the oral arguments right after the election that it's going to survive. And maybe a bunch of people like Biden says, well, we have restrained them.
Right.
Our warning showed them that they shouldn't do this, and now we can move on to other issues.
Yeah. I mean, that seems very to me. But we're going to take some questions, but I have to ask you guys, very quickly, since we've talked for 40 minutes, assuming Trump is going to lose. What happens, in 5 sentences or less, or more, what happens to conservatism over 4 years with a reelected President Trump? Sam, let's start with you.
Well, to echo Ramesh's point at the beginning of our discussion, I think it depends a great deal how Trump wins. And if he is able to win a convincing victory, whether a result of so-called shy Trump voters presenting themselves or for other reasons, then he will truly be master of his party. I mean, to pull a rabbit out of his hat in that way, not once but twice, would be an extraordinary political feat. That said, at least as far as anyone can tell, that seems fairly unlikely. If he wins, it is more likely to be a TKO than a KO, and possibly involving some degree of judicial intervention. And I really don't know what happens if Trump is reelected on what seem to be merely technical or dubious grounds, either for the conservative movement or Republican Party, or more broadly for the country. For me, a disputed election is really the nightmare scenario, and to the extent that I am entitled to pray for anything, it's a clear outcome one way or the other.
Ramesh or Dan?
So my guess would be, just because it's generally true of second terms, that the party, I mean, the country as a whole would continue to swing away from the incumbent's point of view. And we've seen, I think, a pretty pronounced leftward shift in a lot of areas, or sometimes, as in the matter of trade and immigration, it's not exactly a normal left-right thing, but an anti-Trump movement in public opinion on the underlying issues. And I think that would be likely to continue in a second term. You'd probably see a pretty good Democratic triumph in the 2022 elections. I don't think that I think it's true that Trump would be solidifying his hold on the party, but I don't think it's true that the internal Republican debate about where should we go, what should we stand for, what kind of economic agenda should we have, I don't think that becomes any clearer at all, because Trump in a lot of ways prevents such a debate from really happening in earnest, because he doesn't particularly have a clear sense of where he wants to go, and his consolidating power is not the consolidation of the point of view within the party.
I'd say that presidents like to make their second term about foreign policy and about putting a kind of capstone on their administrations. And I think the Trump administration has been getting a better handle on personnel over recent months. And if Donald Trump is reelected in November, you're actually going to see some pretty significant foreign policy realignments and repositionings. I think both with respect to NATO and Europe, and also in terms of our Afghanistan policy, you might actually see Trump following through on the things he had committed to and promised in 2016. And Republicans will then face a choice. Now, partly, of course, the question is what happens to the Republican Senate, as well as what happens with Donald Trump's own reelection. But I could very much see the Republicans deciding that Donald Trump now deserves the chance to be kind of the Nixon going to China in terms of foreign policy and reorienting our posture. It's not going to be the cornball isolationism that is sort of caricatured by a lot of Trump's opponents. We've seen with respect to Germany, for example, that Trump has been drawing down some of the forces there, but he's actually been repositioning some of them to Poland. Trump has actually expanded NATO over his 4 years. Nevertheless, though, I think you will see a little bit more of a professionalization of Trump's foreign policy team, and I think you'll see a real rethinking about what the long-term agenda for conservative foreign policy should be, and you'll see the first steps starting to be made by the new Trump foreign policy team to create not just a sort of legacy for himself in foreign policy, but also something that's probably going to have long legs over the next decade and more.
Okay, I think I've asked enough questions. It's 2:55. We're going to try and go about 20 more minutes with Q&A. I don't think it makes sense to try and hold people on Zoom too much beyond that. So we'll start with a question that picks up on some of our conversations about the court. This is from Chad Bailey, and he says, presuming Biden wins, how will state legislatures and governments that are controlled by conservative majorities react to the, again, assuming newly conservative or more conservative Supreme Court? How much will conservative groups like gun and pro-life groups coordinate state or national efforts with the new court in mind. What do you guys think?
Bigly, right? I mean, there's each administration of the last three, we've had an increase in the amount of litigation from dissenting states, and it's been reasonably coordinated and sophisticated, not always. And I expect that if there were a Biden administration, there'd be a ton of challenges to various alleged infringements on state prerogatives, or just the states might try to essentially kind of in the judicial branch kind of interpose themselves against various administration initiatives, and then the conservative Supreme Court's going to have to decide whether, what role it wants to play, presumably on a case-by-case basis. But yeah, there'll be huge challenges.
Ramesh, what do you think happens with abortion in a Roberts Barrett court?
Good question. I suspect that the holding in Roe and its successor cases gets narrowed, so that it becomes possible for state legislatures to regulate abortion more. For example, maybe banning it in the third trimester, with an exception only for grave threats to physical health, that kind of thing. But I mean, I suppose it's not outside the bounds of possibility that Roe is simply overturned, that the court just says, look, our efforts to draw a line here purportedly based on the Constitution between permissible and impermissible abortion regulations just hasn't worked and can't work, and we're just going to get out of the field altogether. But I think that's the less likely scenario.
All right, here's
Although
a question.
The one I hope for. Yeah.
Right. I want to press you further, but let's give someone else a chance. So a question from Chase Vinci. What do you guys see as the future of the right's intervention in moderation or regulation of big tech platforms, especially given the recent New York Post scandal? Is this something that can be a bipartisan issue? What do you guys think?
Well, I'm skeptical that it would be bipartisan. There's a lot of energy on the right now to try to crack down on the censorial abuses that these platforms are engaging in. But a lot of it is more sort of more nervous energy than it is energy that's being applied to a really plausible legislative agenda. And there are, sort of fault lines here between libertarians and non-libertarians, which perhaps are a significant fault for the coalition's integrity going forward. So I think you're going to continue to see Josh Hawley and others hammer away at this issue. But I don't know exactly that anything's going to come of it. I think it's going to be something that people talk about, but it's very hard to see, especially since I don't think it will be a bipartisan concern. I don't think you're going to see any action. It's just going to be something people, again, sort of focus on rhetorically.
Yeah, I think the idea that there's bipartisanship on this issue is something of an illusion, because the criticisms are directly opposite each other. One of the reasons a lot of liberals and Democrats are mad about big tech is they want them to crack down more on speech, and the conservatives have exactly the opposite criticism. I can't claim to be an expert on the policy issues involved here, but I do. Anytime I see somebody say something like, well, if you get rid of Section 230, Twitter will have to shut down, I do find myself saying, and the downside is, what's your argument against this?
Well, and this is, I mean, to the extent that you could imagine some sort of bipartisanship, right? It's less in what your goal is for the platform and more some kind of consensus that these platforms are too powerful one way or another, right? So,
well, I do think that it would be a good idea to let the media organizations that are in this weak bargaining position against Facebook and Google to be able to band together, like give them some antitrust exemptions so that at least their ad revenue doesn't get cannibalized. But that's the sort of boring process thing that maybe doesn't get the real, the juices flowing for people who really dislike these organizations.
All right, let's take a personnel question from Peter Woodkey. Can the panel handicap the race for GOP Senate leadership? Should Mitch McConnell step down? Anyone?
I don't have any strong opinions.
So I hold on this question.
I mean, there's such a question as to what's going to happen with the Republican Senate majority come November that, there's just too many unknowns here. So,
well, so I mean, but let me push you guys, because certainly we've been talking about Donald Trump's Republican Party, but in so many ways, this has been Mitch McConnell's Republican Party for so long. And we obviously don't know if he won't be majority leader or minority leader in some future. But, Ramesh.
Well, McConnell
I don't see, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, please.
I don't see any serious challenge to McConnell as minority leader. I mean, you framed the question as if he decides to step down. He's not going to, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think it's a leadership style that holds everything close to the vest, that is often extremely tactically smart. But among its potential weaknesses is it's not particularly concerned about building up a bench to succeed itself. And I can see some people who might be plausible future Senate leaders, none of whom would actually take McConnell on. And I can see some people who would take him on who are not plausible Senate Republican leaders.
That's a fair answer. All right, picking up on the earlier conversation Ramesh and I were having a little bit about court packing and filibuster scenarios. Jeremiah Begley asks, how seriously should we take the possibility of a real left-wing power consolidation achieved by some combination of court packing, statehood for Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia, abolition of the Electoral College, federalization of blue state debt? What do you guys think of those and other scenarios for a Biden era?
I actually think they're pretty remote. I don't think that institutional rejiggering is what the American public wants. I don't think it's the thing that you want to spend your political capital on. And I don't even know that the Democratic Party is necessarily going to be, sort of one mind when it comes to operationalizing these things. Now, these different possibilities, statehood for Puerto Rico or DC, packing the court, they all come with different probability assignments. But I think all of this is I think most of it is pretty far-fetched. I think there's very few steps that, all of these are very high-risk strategies. They all are not things that can be implemented very easily. And to be honest, I mean, even if Biden comes in there with a Democratic Senate, he has basically 2 years in which to figure out what he's doing before he's going to have a reaction in the midterm election. And that's not a lot of time to get something sort of grandiose put on the agenda.
Yeah, I agree very much with Dan, and that's one of the reasons that I find some of the more dire predictions of what Biden-Harris America look like rather far-fetched. I mean, there's an argument that America becomes California under permanent one-party rule. There is no escape. We are all subject to the dictates of the National Democratic Party. I just don't think that's plausible, partly because some of these institutional changes that have been proposed, as Dan says, are very unlikely, but also because in a two-party system, there is a very strong tendency for the out party to bounce back rather quickly. And I am old enough to have lived through, let me see, at least 2 ostensibly permanent majorities, one for Republicans, one for Democrats, neither of which lasted longer than about 4 years. I'm skeptical that we are looking into a permanent Democratic majority that will then be cemented by institutional change.
So at the risk of making a kind of obvious point, but one thing that we haven't mentioned, that if Trump does pull out another victory, I do think that the progressive side's disaffection from American political institutions and the American political systems deepens. And even to a certain degree, this could be taken the wrong way, I know, but I think a certain kind of anti-Americanism would grow stronger, a kind of giving up on the American people for having, even if by strong plurality or even by not even a plurality, but that too many of their fellow Americans will have made what to them seems like the obviously wrong choice.
What odds do you guys give what seems to me to be the most likely of those shifts that the questioner listed, the abolition of the filibuster? What odds do you give the legislative filibuster surviving 4 years of Biden presidency?
I don't know about a number, but just running through those possibilities, that is certainly the easiest change to make, because it's just a question of internal legislative procedure. There are much higher obstacles to court packing, to statehood for Puerto Rico, and above all, to statehood for the District of Columbia, which at least on some accounts would require a constitutional amendment.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to get rid of the filibuster to accomplish some of those other goals. Right. And so it's kind of by definition, it's got to be easier to get rid of the filibuster. I think it's got a better chance of surviving than people think. I think that the filibuster can be, it's not just a question of looking forward to the day when your side doesn't have power. It's also just looking to the immediate future and thinking there's all kinds of issues where if you are the 51st most liberal senator in the country, maybe you don't want to have the responsibility for, making or breaking every big substantive issue that engages actual voter passions. And maybe for that reason, it's easier for you to duck on the procedural issue, which will get, a lot of people on the Twitter left mad with you, but no voters in, let's just say, West Virginia are ever going to care about. Or to the extent that they do care about, they're going to care about it the other way.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I would also just add as a footnote to this whole conversation that the impetus for sort of institutional revision tends to come from the out party. So if Donald Trump is reelected, I think the Democrats will be very, strong on this theme of, all kinds of, radical changes to our system. If Donald Trump loses, I think you're going to see a revival of conservative calls for an Article 5 convention and for various kinds of fixes that the right has been or had been asking for during the Obama years, and which probably would have been a major issue if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016.
So none of you gave me a number. For my last question, I'm going to force you all to give me a number. But
I was a history major, Ross.
Right? No, I know, but we're gonna hold off. We're gonna hold off on that and try and take, I guess, two more audience questions and then finish up. So, I guess this sort of picks up on the question of whether conservatism could be sort of reduced or discredited more substantially in defeat. We have a question from an anonymous attendee who says, has Trump contributed to any long-term scarring to conservative issues? For instance, any concern about the coarsening of society or governmental corruption, right? These are sort of classic conservative issues where maybe Trump has undercut conservative messaging, or will these issues or problems just fade when the man leaves? And since we haven't talked about QAnon, but Dan brought it up, I'll throw in conspiracy theories on the internet as another potential long-term scar or challenge for conservatism. What do you think happens with these kind of issues?
I think they all pre-existed Trump, and they're not going to get any better. And Trump is really, whether he's accelerated them or not, is in the long run not going to matter one way or the other. Corruption, well, people certainly had corruption concerns about Hillary Clinton. On the right, there are deep corruption concerns about the Biden family. So coarsening, well, both parties obviously accuse one another of, sort of coarsening things. We saw this with the way conservatives talked about Bill Clinton. We've seen it now with, the way that Donald Trump has conducted himself and the way his critics have gone after him. I just think, we're in store for more of the same, regardless of what happens. And even if, Hillary Clinton had been elected rather than Donald Trump, corruption, coarsening, and, this general sense of, a cold civil war, as some of our friends say, would have been a very powerful undercurrent in American politics, one way or the other, and it's still going to be with us in the next 4 years and probably the next, decade and more to come.
I'm inclined. I agree with what Dan says. I'm inclined to sort of meet the question halfway, to the extent that Trump might signal the end of a certain kind of Republican respectability politics, which was a specialty of the George W. Bush administration, which was not necessarily so different substantively, but was different in its public presentation. This sort of model, this vision of what it meant to be presidential, how a president looked, how a president sounded. We seem to be beyond that now. That said, I think you can make a case that I believe on at least some days that that's not altogether a bad thing, because respectability politics can be, and often were, a sort of veil for all sorts of ugliness that predated Trump and will continue after Trump. And there may be some advantage, unpleasant as it often is, in being forced to confront that reality.
I do think that if Trump is seen to have lost, in part, or an important part, because of his lack of decorum or sobriety or respectability, that does have an effect. That it somewhat counteracts the long-running tendencies we've had toward a lowering of those kinds of standards. But it'll be interesting to see, if Biden is victorious, the extent to which he tries to carry himself in a very self-consciously un-Trumpian way, and the extent to which he gets flack from some of his allies for maybe not taking the low road as much as Trump did or would have. Of course, we could have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission I've been reading about on Twitter, in which case all of this looks very different.
Well, that'll be a very decorous Truth and Reconciliation Commission, though. So.
Well, we're already confined in our homes as conservatives, so it won't be that different, right?
All right, so let's ask a question from the audience about the future, and then I'll give you my final question, and we'll wrap up. Will Quinn asks, what are the prospects for a future standard bearer on the right emerging from state government or elsewhere rather than the Senate? In the abstract, what qualities would one cast for in that leader? And are there any leaders on the horizon who fit that kind of description, in the panel's opinion?
Well, there's nobody, that I would name offhand as being the, sort of Ronald Reagan of the future. I do think that the states are at least as promising as the Senate, if not more so, and I'm kind of troubled by the general tendency of the Senate on the Republican side towards a kind of grandstanding and ideological presentation in recent years. And I think the states are the more natural forum for the development of presidential leadership. I think what we would ideally like to see on the right is a happy warrior, someone like Ronald Reagan, in the sense that he's combining the happiness with the warrior part. What Donald Trump represented was the idea that he's going to fight for you. He's someone who really does viscerally dislike the same opponents that the people who were voting for him disliked, and that he, in some ways was emotionally resonating with his voters, and they felt as if this is a guy who has our back. You see this even now when you interview steel workers and others who voted for him. You can question them about policies, but it turns out they're not so interested in policies as they are in the idea that Donald Trump is someone who is fundamentally fighting alongside them in the battles that, are confronting them in their lives. So I think you really need that. And you didn't have that with John McCain, and you didn't have that with Mitt Romney. And those were serious weaknesses and deficiencies with those two candidates. You didn't even really have it with George W. Bush, certainly not in 2000. And that again was a weakness and deficiency. So you need to have that warrior element that Donald Trump has. But ideally, you need to have that warrior element combined with a sense of optimism, openness, and happiness that you got with Ronald Reagan, that's able to reach a different kind of voter, and someone who feels a little bit more satisfied with their life and isn't looking for someone to come in and sort of start a street brawl. So that sort of combination of those two qualities, it's something I hope that there's a state out there that can produce that. Although, again, right now, I don't necessarily see a leader who has that fusion.
I think that the traditional advantage that governors have had over senators in presidential politics has not gone away at all. I would much rather be if I was looking for the 2024 nomination, I'd much rather be a governor or former governor than a senator. Of course, there are one or two people who meet both descriptions.
Are you sure it hasn't gone away? I mean, it seems to some extent like the nationalization of politics at this point is such that, at least in 2016, it was very hard for figures like Scott Walker and Chris Christie. There was complicated stuff there, obviously, but it was hard for Republican governors in 2016 to sort of get traction on a traditional, look what I've done for you in my state platform.
But I think that part of Trump's appeal in 2016 in the primaries was that he was an executive. That in some ways, actually, he was the most sort of central casting executive on the stage because of different personal qualities of the actual governors who had run. And the legislators, I think, we had a ton of senators running last time, were, I think, handicapped in various ways by just being talkers.
Is there any governor who has, you guys have mentioned, the role that Ronald Reagan played in the Nixon era, right, when he was, sort of coming off his time as governor of California. Is there any governor, apart from arguably Nikki Haley, who has, at the end of the Trump era, you would say, this era has been good for their political standing within the party or their political future?
Noam, Ducey, Haley, Scott all come to mind. Probably a couple I'm forgetting.
All right. That's a good answer. I have one last question, though. I have two last questions, and the first one is actually substantive. So I'm going to keep us till 3:20 to ask this question. So I've just been thinking about, so we have, a narrative, I think a plausible narrative of the Biden presidency, where he comes in and, as you guys were saying, he tries to pass some big omnibus spending bill, and it unites the factions of the GOP in opposition, and you have a return of GOP deficit hawkness and so on. Isn't this just sort of this kind of eternal cycle that the Republican Party is stuck in, where you have, you become deficit hawks under a Democrat, and then, and then you have sort of a bunch of people who think they're going to run as a deficit hawk, and then a George W. Bush compassionate conservative, or, Donald Trump, big government conservative, populist nationalist comes along. I mean, is there, I guess I'm just asking all of you, is there any escape from this sort of cycle of a party that seems, critical of government, out of power, and then kind of wants to use government but doesn't really know how to do it when it's in power? Does that ever change? Or is this just sort of an eternal recurrence?
Well, I think you're always going to have different ideologies or different ideological emphases depending on whether your party is in power or in opposition. And that's true on the left as well as on the right. And it actually, the right hasn't had a problem in terms of fielding presidential candidates who are in some ways the reverse of its congressional or oppositional ideology. So George W. Bush, when he ran in 2000 as a compassionate conservative, he formed himself in part in opposition to the Newt Gingrich brand of very harsh, congressional conservatism that was in opposition to Bill Clinton. Donald Trump comes along in 2016, and obviously he represents, something that in emotional registers is perhaps close to the Tea Party, but in terms of how it, responds in policy respects to the Paul Ryan moment in Republican politics, was actually very much a negation and very much a move away from it. So, I think that there is a certain pattern here that is recurrent, but I also think that it's not quite as debilitating as the way you framed the question may have suggested.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that that's just a feature of electoral politics, when parties cycle in and out of power rather than a particular problem for Republicans or conservatives. What I do think is a recurring problem is the tension between populism or sort of demotic political style and the requirements of staffing a government, which also means supporting people who will be capable of moving into office while the party is out of power. Again, one has seen these arguments saying, well, we don't need college-educated voters. There are votes to be won among non-college whites and non-whites for that matter. That may be true as a specifically electoral position, but the people who are going to act as administrators and staffers and judges and lawyers are not going to be 55-year-old ex-steel workers. So rather than a sort of ideological tension, I think Republicans and conservatives face a sociological tension of how you sustain and cultivate the elite or governing elements that every successful party needs in order to wield power, while attacking those elements in at least some of the sort of rhetorical framework of the party.
Ramesh, I'm gonna just push you on this, because you and I were both in certain ways, attached to this thing you mentioned earlier called reform conservatism. And, in part, as I understood it, reform conservatism was an attempt to pivot the Republican Party away from at least some of the anti-government reflexes of the Tea Party era and towards a more constructive style of governing. That was the theory. That was what we told ourselves, something like that, right? And Donald Trump came along and sort of swamped it, but he swamped it while also making sweeping promises for what government can do. And then, that sort of, we can argue about how successful that was, but it just seems, having passed through those sort of different stages of, Tea Party sort of, attempted incrementalism on op-ed pages, followed by the Trump era. Is it not slightly depressing to think that conservatism could just be starting the cycle all over again? Or are you two just, do you think this is just politics and how it always is destined to be?
Well, there's certainly going to, when you're in opposition, you're going to oppose. But the problem is, if you have an opposition-oriented movement that is not also, at least to some extent, at least fractionally, a kind of solution-oriented movement, then you don't really know what to do once you win power. You become, the dog that caught the car. And I think we saw that most strikingly on healthcare in the Obama years and then the early Trump years. This huge rallying cry, we're totally going to get rid of this. And then, oh, wait, you mean we actually have to know something about healthcare policy if we're going to do this? That sounds pretty boring. So that I think is the problem. I mean, I think, when we were trying to advance various policy initiatives, our chief problem was never alternative policy agendas that were superior or were more politically attractive. The chief problem was a lack of interest in policy agendas. And that wasn't a kind of just a populist thing. That was also an establishment Republican thing. I well recall the discussion I had with a prominent Republican senator in 2014 who was saying, why would we want to have a healthcare plan of our own? We should just leave that to our presidential candidate next time. Well, how did that work out? So I would say, in closing, there is hope, but not for us.
All right. Thank you, Ramesh. But I promised a last question, and this can have the shortest possible answer, but it has to be a percentage. Donald Trump loses in 2020. Each of you, Sam, then Ramesh, then Dan, odds that he runs again in 2024.
And I have to give. You have to
give odds.
Give odds
as a percentage.
20%.
Okay, Dan or Ramesh.
15. Pass the torch. Let Ivanka and Don Jr. duke it out.
Dan.
25%.
All right. That's our show. I mean, that's our panel. Thank you all so much for attending virtually. Thank you all for your questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them and that I bigfooted us slightly at the end. I want to thank Sam, Dan, and Ramesh for a terrific conversation. I want to thank the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America for sponsoring, in my mind at least, another stellar conversation. And with that, it's the middle of the afternoon here on the East Coast, and I invite you all to go enjoy the rest of your day.